Yay. Thank you everyone for coming. Welcome to the Graphic Medicine Confab. This is actually our 5th confab, which is not so bad. Comic study guides, what are they? Why create them? Hooray, something I am really curious about. So I'm Kriota Willberg. The rest of the group that helps to organize these meets are Joel Christian Gill, Ben Schwartz, and Georgia Weber, and myself. So today our guest is Theresa Rojas, and I'm going to read her bio as a way of introducing. I thought about editing it down and then I was like, no, this is really pretty good. So I'm just going to read it straight to give you some background. So Dr. Theresa Rojas is a professor of English and professor of ethnic studies at Modesto Junior College with a specialty in post-1945 comic studies and visual culture. She is an academic senator and the founding director of the Latinx Comics Art Festival. LCAF is the California Central Valley's international celebration of Latinx comic arts creators and friends, highlighting Latinx cartoonists, writers, animators, artists, and comic arts educators. She serves on the executive board of the Graphic Medicine International Collective and is developing a number of projects focusing on the intersection of Latinxes and graphic medicine. So I am so thrilled, we all thrilled that Theresa agreed to come here and be our guest. So we'll turn it over to you.
And awesome. Thank you so much. Do want to mention that, folks, if you have questions, if you have comments and such, feel free to raise your hand if you'd like to speak, or put questions and comments in the chat, and we'll monitor both of those. So yeah, I'm here. I was asked to speak a little bit about study guides because I have done one and I have 2 in process. And what are study guides for us? So as a professor, for me, a study guide is a tool that I can use in order to illuminate a particular text. And in this instance, comics study guides are a fairly new thing. There are folks who work on them, who are dedicated to creating them. But in general, they're a fairly new thing, but it's just like anything that you would find in novels, for example, that are adopted by schools, colleges, universities, where you have discussion questions and that sort of thing. But with comics, we have an opportunity to go much deeper than that, right? To get into discussions about the story, of course, the narrative, but also the visuals, the art, the interaction of the art and the text, and to set that up in ways to make it accessible to, I try to kind of hit the middle school-ish level for the beginning of the study guide, and then I always have some advanced questions. Since I am a college professor, I like to offer that. So what I want to do by way of introduction is to show you the first study guide that I did. I'm going to share my screen, and this is from the definitive bilingual version of the book called Quince. I know it looks like quince, but it's in, the title's in Spanish. It's Quince, and quince is short for quinceañera, which is the 15th birthday in Latino culture, particularly Mexican culture. It is the 15th birthday of women, and there's a big celebration that is it's the coming of age celebration. So this is the study guide, and in general, I like to do about a 4-page study guide. That's how I set it up in Word. What it looks like when it's actually published may be completely different, but if you think about roughly 4 pages in Word, that's a really good starting point for, okay, here, this covers some good material. And then if the publisher or the creator wants more, you can work from there. If they want less, they can just extrapolate they need. So I like to do, the main characters. This is great for students or for anyone who's trying to keep track of who's who. I like to give an overview of who are the main characters. And if there's something that we need to know, like in this case, a brief history of the quinceañera, that's always helpful. Like, is there a particular cultural event? Is there geography that we need to get into just a little bit to kind of set the stage? So in this case, it's the quinceañera. And then I have some important vocabulary highlighted here. And then on the next page, we have, and this is the way I do study guides. And I stole this, full disclosure, a little bit from, I forget who I stole it from, and it'll come to me in a minute. But the formatting, I borrowed it. So concepts, these are a combination for this particular text. These are a combination of major concepts from this text, but then also because it's a comic and there are some pop culture references, I wanted to make sure that we touched on those. So this text makes a reference to the movie Carrie, right? The Stephen King film / novel. And I wanted to make sure that was in there because newer students, newer generations might not necessarily know right away what that is. So Carrie, and then the term fangirl comes up. So I included that. And then this is where the study questions that I said right around the middle school level is where we start, and just some open-ended questions to get discussions started. It can be in the classroom, or if you were reading the text together as a group, or things that you might be wondering about that you want to kind of share with people. That's where I start the study questions. And then my favorite part is the advanced study. As a professor, I'm always trying to think of assignments that I can give my students that get them interacting with the comic text. So I should say that for the courses that I teach, certain courses that I teach, all of the texts are comics. Like when I teach composition, all of the texts now are comics. It really makes it more interesting and more relevant for my students. So I'm always looking for interesting activities and discussion points for them. And then when I teach literature, we always have a unit on comics of some sort. I'm going to be teaching ethnic studies. I'm sort of newly appointed professor of ethnic studies, and I'm looking forward to bringing in some graphic memoirs into those, and including some graphic medicine texts to really talk about issues of critical race theory and that sort of thing. So back to the advanced study, you can see what I'm going for here in the advanced study is how do we get to critical analysis, right? Not just discussing what happened and what it might mean, but like right here, for example, a critical analysis of a page. So we're doing a close reading if we do that one. Or this one, Quince uses different panel sizes and shapes to guide the reader's eye. So there I want my students to get into a discussion about geometry, about motion, how does the text work with the art to move the narrative forward. And then we might also have something like write an essay. So the assignment is you're looking at Quince and you're writing an essay about a particular directed topic. So I offer some of that. And that's it for my part. And for this particular text, I just want to point quickly to that this was translated into Spanish. I did not do the Spanish translation because I speak Spanish, but my Spanish skills are not that good. But it's really nice that this particular text, that Quince has a Spanish version. This book is a flip book. So I'm going to stop my share. So you can read it in English, you can read the study guide, and there are a couple of academic essays and introductory essays, and then you can flip it and read it in Spanish, and you have the study guide in Spanish as well. So that's a really cool thing about this book. So yeah, I mean, that's a start, and I'm happy to answer questions and get into the discussion, and let's talk about study guides.
Can I start the
Yeah,
questions?
of course.
So, you, with the book, so you made the study guide for Quince. How do you distribute the study guide, or how is it available in tandem with
Yeah.
the book? Like,
You
how
know, I
does
should
that
have
work?
grabbed it. So excuse me for the awkward moment right here. So it has, I think for the most part, the plan is when you do this is that it's integrated into the book, right?
Okay.
So, and in some cases, what I've seen is you have the original version that no one thought of doing a study guide for, and then someone said, hey, you know, I've been teaching this and we could really use a study guide for this thing. So there are two options there where you could create a study guide separately, and of course in this day and age, you know, you PDF it, that kind of thing, and then you have it available electronically as a separate thing or as a separate booklet. But then there's also the option which I prefer, which is to have the next version of the book, so the next publication of the book, and have that study guide integrated in with the book. And I think that's much more useful, just as a human who loses things.
Mhm.
If they're together, if they're stuck together, then I'm more likely to keep them together. And so for my students, it's easier for them to keep track of things. Let's see if I can find the sweet spot here. So here's the book. Yeah, there it is right there. And so the study, you can see how this is a substantial book, right? So the study guide's right in the middle. The Spanish and the English are stuck right there in the middle of this book. I love this. This book is so heavy. I love it so much. So so they planned that ahead. The original version of Quince does not have a study guide. It's a smaller trade. And when they were planning the definitive bilingual edition as a flip book, the study guide is one of the things that they wanted in there. Another thing that you can do um, to integrate the sort of scholarly materials and a study guide is you can have scholarly essays. So one really good example of that is um, something that I can't remember the name of. Okay, we're gonna get there. Bitter Root. That's it. So Bitter Root Volume 1, the first the first trade has these beautiful essays in it. And they're essays that touch on things that are happening in the trade. And they're really thoughtful and they're thought provoking. And they get into things like critical race theory and theories of space and the monstrous and all kinds of stuff. And I have taught Bitterroot because it's an excellent piece, but also because it has those essays included in it, so we can use those to discuss the material as a kind of study guide. I think of those as study guide materials. Another one that has those is Bitch Planet. If you get, and I want to say, I think Bitch Planet, the collected version, does not have them. I think those were taken out for some reason. But if you get them in single issue form, they have these great editorial essays at the end, and those are just fantastic for discussion.
Yeah, I love Bitch Planet. Actually, it's one of my
Yeah.
favorite series. And just from what you're talking about, it, I'm also like thinking about study guides for like mini comics for self-published work,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
how having it might be like the next time I get to meet in person at a comics festival, I might actually try to offer comics without a study guide and then mini comics with the study guide, you know, or
Yeah.
like offer that through my distributor. I think that's like a really interesting idea.
Yeah, I mean, I think you could just do like a single page. If it's a small entity, you could do just a one-page study guide, or however many pages you need to do to get the book to fall into the right number of pages. Um, and just do it like that, because then it's there, and it's, if people like it, great. If they want to use it, great, you have it. It doesn't have to be huge, but if not, then that's fine. You don't have to have the two different versions. That's what I would recommend. I mean, I could see something like I can't think of a title, but something like even a zine, let's say something small, having a couple of pages at the end that says, you know, let's talk about it, and then some discussion questions and some. That's a study guide. It doesn't have to be super formal, but anything that offers material for you to launch a discussion or launch some deeper critical thinking. For me, that's a study guide. There's
I was
Yeah.
just gonna add that in when Strange Fruit came out after the fact, there was a lot of study guides written for it, but they weren't included into books. So my publisher at the time was Fulcrum, and it's just changed recently. But they created an entire website that was like, here are places where you can go and find extra things about these things. So for example, I did a story about Richard Potter. So there was a story about early magic. So like if you wanted to learn more about early magic, you could go to the website and it had some questions about early magicians and how that was integrated. Or like when I did a story about Stagecoach Mary Field, there would be like women in the Old West. There was like more stuff like they had people go out and research it. And I know that Lion Forge had someone that they actually hire people specifically to write study guides for some of the books.
Yeah.
So when you've got, with Bitterroot, like when you're David Walker and you're friends with John Jennings, you can just say, John, will you write this thing for me?
Right.
And you got John to do that, right? But other people have to go out, because John wrote for Bitch Planet too, I think. But when you have to go out and figure that other stuff out, like you don't necessarily have to go about this like this big long academic process. It's just like, what are some key points, or what are some things that people might find interesting to talk about, and what's some places you can talk about it. And it makes the books much more marketable for education, because when the salespeople go out into the world to start selling this, and they're like, look, you can use this in your classroom during this time, and you can talk about these things. So it gets selling points as well when you have things, because publishers have, like the salespeople for the distributors have to sell those books. And if you're looking at education market, that's a really good way to do it.
It's also a good way to get your book adopted for as a common read, right? When there's a study guide that makes it quite attractive. I also want to say that not every book is conducive to having a study guide, right? Not just because it's I mean, I look at comics as text, as some are literary, some are not so literary, some are just sort of fun, some just sort of live. And not everything, you can't make a study guide necessarily for anything. Well, I guess you can, but in terms of quality, right? So one of the things about Quince is that I always feel like I'm doing a commercial. It just happens to be the first one that I did, and it's a great book, but there's a lot of meat on that bone. There's a lot of there's a lot to discuss, including just the situating it culturally as what is a quinceañera, what is the significance. So the story, the main arc of the story is that Lupe, the main character, turns 15 and she has superpowers for her 15th year, but only for a year. So there are 15 original issues, and then they're compiled together for this book. So very well planned out, very strategic. And then with the study guide, just makes it, as Joel was saying, super marketable for a variety of age groups. And that's another thing that you want to think about is you may have a target audience, but how can you also make that study guide relevant to other potential audiences? And I'm always thinking college level to begin with, because I have complete freedom for the text that I choose. So if something has those extra materials in it that make it easier for me to pull it into my class, then I'm all about it. And I want to point to the chat. KSW's phone has a question: is the study guide itself a comic or written in essay form? And that really depends on the study guide. I think you absolutely could make it in comic form, do a sort of Scott McCloud kind of thing with it. That wasn't what I was asked of from me, so I just did straight writing. I'm much faster doing just the straight writing, but I have certainly seen study guides that have kind of comics integrated into them. I think you could absolutely do that. And yes, I agree with Kathy that the leaving out the essays, I don't understand unless it was just a cost issue, but that seems a little odd to me. Leaving out those essays is terrible. Yeah, exactly. Boo.
Something came up for me while you were talking about this, because going through the sample that you showed us, the first few things made perfect sense to me as just like, oh yeah, I could quickly type out like who are the characters present here and what are some of the that I'm working with. But as someone who has made a book that I was very aware, I was like stuffing that suitcase so densely. I immediately, when you got to the for advanced study section, I was like, oh my God, I could write a whole other book about just here's what I was doing. And I don't really necessarily want to be the artist who's like screaming at everyone, like explicitly saying like, look what I did, look what I did. But I find that really interesting. And I guess I'm just raising it as like, this is something that I find interesting to think about, but almost like I think I need to ask someone else to write these for me so that I don't end up just being someone who's explaining their own work. Yes. Or like guiding.
Call me, Georgia. Call me. I do this.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, but I agree. And it's interesting. Of course, I have a lot of cartoonist friends, and I've had some of these conversations about, well, you know, I'm so, number one, I'm so close to it. I don't really know, like, what do college students study or what is studyable about my piece. And so there's that, but there's also the issue of just kind of, well, I could take it panel by panel and and we could talk about each and every panel, like where are the limits, right? But one of the limits is how many pages do you want this to be? You know, what do you want this to look like in terms of publication? Are you wanting to just add, like Kriota was saying, when we have conventions again, would you just like to have something small at the end or something, you know, separate? Or are you thinking, hey, the next, you know, the 2.0 version of this, I really want to have maybe a 4-page or a 6-page study guide. I have a friend, a really wonderfully strategic friend who publishes different versions of his work, and he will add things like his own editorial essays where he'll have, he'll have the history of how he came to these ideas, and then he'll have maybe an interview, and then I've done an interview with him, so he's added that, and then he's thinking about study guides in the future. And so I think that's really cool, although it's one of those things where you're like, oh, the variant cover, now there's the other variant cover, and then there's the other variant. This has all these extra bits, but people love that sort of thing at the same time, right? So there's a level of marketability to that. There's a question in the chat, Juan Carlos. Is the comic study guide intended for a particular course? No, I would say no. In fact, you want it to be kind of broad. It's more when you're writing a study guide, or when you're designing and putting a study guide together, you're thinking about I would say at least a couple of age groups. I wouldn't want to make one that's only accessible to college students or only accessible to, you know, elementary students, but that's always I always think of it in terms of, let's set the bar a little bit high-ish so that it can be used. And again, as a college professor, I'm always thinking about that. But 15 is a younger, it's in that younger zone of age group. And so middle school was important for me to hit that, and then also potentially college level. But you could design something for a particular course, but then that's just course planning, right? That's a little bit of a different thing. Although I do steal from that all the time. Like, oh, this assignment worked really well. I think I can use that for a study guide, and then give other folks ideas on how to do that sort of assignment. So yeah, thanks for that.
Theresa, for the study guides that you've worked on, I'm curious, how closely did you work or collaborate with the creators on those, and what was that experience like for you?
So for Quince, not at all. Quince was entirely me reading. Well, so for Quince, I was asked to consider doing the study guide first. And what I did was I reread the book. I had already read the book. I reread it to see, can I even create something out of this? Because there was another one that I was asked to do, and the book just wasn't, it was I want to say pulp, but I don't mean to use that negatively because I read pulp all the time. But there wasn't enough meat on that bone for me to make a study guide out of it. So I had to say, I had to pass. And maybe it was just someone else needed to do that. But for Quince, as I was reading it, I was annotating and I had a lot of notes. So to me, when it generates a lot of notes, that means yes, there's a lot, there's depth here, and we can go there. That's not to say that you can't create something that's has less depth to it, right? But kind of the point is, if you're going to, like, bring it to the classroom sort of thing, that you need to have enough material to work with. Another one that I'm going to be doing in the future, I'm good friends with the cartoonist, and I've taught his work many times, and I have had enough conversations with him about his work and had so many students bringing up questions and things that I've been keeping track of, that there's sort of a conversation in retrospect, if that makes sense. I feel like I've gotten a lot of feedback from him on student questions, and then the student feedback that I could do that. And then if I have questions, be in contact with him. But I have yet to have that sort of one-on-one, part by part. And I think that's important. I think that might be a little awkward, unless there was something that came up and I'm wanting to define, like in terms of definitions, like, oh, I think this cultural celebration or this word, if I'm dealing with another culture, this word means this, then I would want to have that conversation to say, okay, so for you, what does this mean? And then I think I would include some kind of description of that. So maybe for the general public, this means this, but in, Mexican culture, this means that. And so you can kind of make that useful. But does that answer the question fully, I think? Awesome.
Yeah. There's also some excellent questions in the chat too.
So, okay, let's see, where did we leave off?
Looks like some big philosophical questions about how do you go over the basics of comics, which I think is like a big, long sort of thing, specifically in terms of like, like I just in like that in and of itself is just like a really big complicated thing, because we have all of the classes that teach comics and then classes that teach with comics. Like you get this like real difference between those two kinds of things. So
yeah, and it's a great question, and the answer is an easy answer. No. no. I think that is the whoever's teaching that's their responsibility. Mine is just to generate discussion and activity and fun stuff to go in depth with the material, but not to offer how to read the material. And I part of that is because I'm honoring whoever the educator is who's using it, right? Educator or cartoonist or whatever folks want to call themselves, because we have different some colleagues, for example, at my college, they don't go over that at all. They'll use American Born Chinese, for example, is a text that I have guest lectured on a few times for a particular course, and there isn't really a discussion in that course on how to read comics. It's just presented as another piece of literature. So that's one way of reading the text. And then when I have guested for that, I've gone over how to read this as a comic and the different interactions and the cognitive stuff that's going on when you read a comic. That's a different approach. So I don't put that into the study guides at all. And then how much of a guide should address the basics? Oh, this is, yeah, the kind of the same. That was actually the question. And then, does the guide emphasize writing over illustration, or do you think try to balance these in the guide? Yeah, another great question. I try to balance it. I think for the more middle grade discussion questions, those tend toward writing. I haven't written too many of like, here's an activity for K through 12 kind of thing, because I don't teach K through 12, but I think that would be easy enough to do. And then for the advanced part, that's where I emphasize thinking a lot more about the interaction between text and image, and looking at art and looking at the meaning of art. Are there silent moments, you know, things like that. And I'm also really interested in things like motion in comics, and the geometry of comics, and how the eye is guided. Because I know that with my students, they just want to get to the end of the book. They just want, what happened? And so I try to go beyond what happened to how did it happen? How is this put together in a particular way? So looking at rhetorical choices, and for me that means the rhetorical choices of color and light and shading and shape and line. How do you read a line? What does it mean to read a line? So in that way, you could say I sort of cheat on the bringing in some, you know, basic comics, how to read a comic, because if I'm presenting a question, so if we read a particular line in this way, you know, what does it mean when the line changes halfway through the text? So I'll bring things in that way. Yeah.
You know, it just struck me, you know, as a graphic medicine cartoonist who also teaches graphic medicine to medical students and to art students. I also really like teaching mini comics and zines. Like, I like including work that is self-published, that is like coming from a number of very personal perspectives. And part of me is like thinking that some authors of patient narratives may not feel qualified to write a study guide per se, if they're feeling intimidated by the idea that, you know, they'd be telling medical students how to read the book or something like, you know, it's like, it seems like it could be intimidating. But it's also occurring to me that one of the things that I really like to be able to tell my students, if I know the author of the book, and some things I wish I could tell my students if I didn't know the author of the book, is what the cartoonist was thinking, like what motivated them to write the narrative in the first place, and like what were the most important messages for them to get across. So I'm just curious if you've read any like very like creative or somewhat out there study guides that might like go into like different discussions, you know, that people could use, or if you know any examples of that.
I haven't read any specific examples, but in the notes for things that I'm developing, I've had some conversations about that sort of thing, about, you know, well, people naturally tell you, right, when they're creating, when they're asking you to do something like a study guide, they naturally share the evolution of a work. And so I like to take notes on that kind of thing. And then if it comes up, if it seems appropriate to the story and to what's going on, because one of the things I don't do is I don't pose questions like, what do you think the author meant by? Because then we're asking students to mind read, and I prefer to ask students what they're getting out of it. And why do you think this is put together? And what does this mean that this is put together in a particular way? Which is kind of a sneaky way of asking the same thing. But the thing about asking, what do you think the author was intending, right? Author intention, or to get to some kind of specific truth, is that then we get that, well, I don't know if I'm right about this, but, and my approach is to try to generate and really, really dig for what is your experience
Mhm.
of this text. And
Well,
to,
yeah, and for me, part of it is when I'm teaching, part of the interesting moments for me are when the reader and the author are looking at the narrative from entirely different perspectives.
yeah, yes,
Like I feel like those are very valuable moments about communication in medicine.
yeah,
So,
yes. And there's that thing about what isn't said, right? So one of the things that, and this is not a study guide project, but a project that I'm working on developing with my family, with my sister, is the story of my mom's passing. She passed from pancreatic cancer 3 years ago, and we're sort of still processing it from very different perspectives. And there are all of these really funny moments that happen toward the end that weren't funny then, but are really hilarious now. Just like things flying in the air, and the whole all the medical things involved that you don't, like they give you that book that says, I say that book, for me it's this important text. It's like the death process and you're like, oh, there's a manual, okay, so we're going through and I'm like, shit, we're on page 6. Oh, sorry, we're I'm like, I don't know how fast this thing is going, and you're like, oh, we just jumped to page 12. Things like that, telling that story. But so I have one perspective as the guardian of the book and the reader and the researcher, versus my youngest sister, who was just like, I don't know what's happening, man, like, let me know when you need me, bye. Um so so there's that kind of thing. I think is really interesting because we did not have those conversations. So I want to know about those unspoken things. So you have to become the one to ask the questions, right? You have to be the one to do the poking. And to bring it back to the study guides, the study guide is a way of poking at different interesting things. Which leads me to this question. Do you ask about what happens between panels? So yes and no, because I'm not teaching about gutters exactly, but depending on the text, I might say, so there's a passage of time happening here. We go from moment A to moment D, but we have to fill in the gap. What does that mean? What does it mean that we're being asked to fill in the gaps? What do you think happened between this time and this time? And so I'll shift it and put it that way. How do you avoid steering the readers? That is your own biases and what you're expecting their answers to be to your questions in the guide. I don't know that I avoid steering the readers, to be honest, because I think for certain questions, I want them to get somewhere. I want them to reach a certain point. Now, beyond that, or how they get there, I have no control over. But there are certain things that maybe I want them to. Either go in a particular direction and then kind of let them go, or I want to make sure that they end up somewhere. And then what they do with that endpoint is entirely up to them, right? So I don't pretend, I 100% do not pretend to be objective or unbiased or not at all. I really don't. I think that would make my job way too difficult. And that's me in the classroom as well. When I start teaching the beginning of the semester, I say, this is who I am. This is, I'm a first generation Latina professor. I'm a little bit of a unicorn. And and I'm Catholic. I'm liberal. I grew up in San Francisco. I throw it all, not all of it, but I throw a lot of that out there. And then we go from there, so that I'm not pretending to be this ghostly, unbiased, non-opinionated figure. I tell them that I'm into telenovelas, so I like the gossip, tell me all your stuff. And then that's our launching point. What other questions to folks have. Or any scandal you want to share now that I mentioned it a little bit less? It's a lot of fun to do these things, and it's a lot of fun to be the one who's sort of choosing the questions and choosing the thoughtful moments and the vocabulary and describing characters, that kind of thing. And I want to say that if you're thinking about a study guide for your work, you should do a study guide for your work, whether or not you actually include it. But I think the exercise of doing it is valuable because that tells you a lot about your own work. It's a very reflective thing if you're doing that for your own comics. And why not? Then you have it, you can decide whether or not to use it. But also, ultimately, it makes, as Joel was saying, it raises the potential marketability of your work. And I can tell you that as a professor who teaches comics in my classroom and who has colleagues who are, some are on board and some are kind of, well, I'm not so sure. That addition of that material makes it much easier to adopt a text, to decide to adopt a text, because I have colleagues who are like, I don't know about comics, but they know study guides, they know discussion questions, they know guiding questions, that kind of thing. And so this is a way, I think of it as a way to guide them through the material. It can be a gateway into the material. Study guides is the gateway drug to the material.
It also helps to sort of cement the idea that, like a couple of things, like making people think about what they're reading as opposed to just like not thinking about it. Like, I read that book and I didn't think about it anymore. It's like reading it and then think about that. So like you become an active reader. And I think that's something that should happen more frequently with comics because of the implied relationship between the cartoonist and the person who's reading it, because there are things you have to agree on, right? So that's number one. The other thing is that there are comics that are just going to be like Michael Bay films, right? Like you just go for the explosions, you don't need to talk about it anymore, right? But then there are other things that are going to have layers to it. And sometimes it helps to have those discussion questions in a classroom to get people to think about the layers, like thinking about those layers. Like this thing on its surface may seem like this, but there are a lot of other ways you can read into this without actually thinking about what Alan Moore was thinking about when he designed Dr. Manhattan. We don't actually think about that. We can just look at Dr. Manhattan by himself and take all of the cultural understandings about God and the universe and everything and apply it, and nihilism, and apply it directly to Dr. Manhattan. And we've got a discussion question right there, right? Exactly. And so I think that that's the kind of thing that you're looking for with your work, is to, like, if you're going to make a study guide, is that you want people to have a conversation about, I always call these oh shit moments with my students, right? It's like when you're looking at something and somebody tells you like a little bit of something that gives you like a big piece of everything, right? If you're looking at a piece of art or a book, like the metaphor in To Kill a Mockingbird of the rabid dog, and the rabid dog is the metaphor for the entire town. Like that's an oh shit moment, right? Like the town is the dog, it's a rabid dog. Or when someone tells you like Picasso's Guernica was, like based on this, like that's what those things are. And I think that what you want to do in study guides is give people who are reading this that thing to make them leave thinking about it. Because while I leave thinking about Michael Bay films like their explosions, I don't leave with existential like understandings about explosions. It's just I like Michael Bay films. They're just explosions, right? So like that's the thing. You want to like leave people with extra stuff.
Yeah, I agree 100%. And you want it always to sort of lead into some kind of bigger picture thought conversation. I like to think that folks are, reading this sort of thing and thinking, well, I was just reading a comic. I had no idea that there was, that it was deep. Or like my students like to say, there's some deep shit there, Dr. Rojas. And I'm like, I know, exactly, right? So for me, that's a good, the purpose of the whole thing, right? So yeah, and I answered a few questions in the chat. One of them was, do you ever pitch study guides to cartoonists or publishers, or does it start with them? So my experience so far has been that folks have reached out to me, and for the couple of projects that I'm working on right now, those are paid, which that's how it's going to be moving forward. So, because it's a lot of work, and Juan Carlos asked about how long did it take for this one, and I kept track of the hours, and it was about 16 hours, not including the reading, the original reading of the material. So I have like kind of a rate schedule depending on how big the text is. And if I've already read the text and I know it, then it's a little bit less cost-wise because I'm familiar with the material. But if I'm starting from scratch, or if it's going to be something that's like part of a series, then I kind of work that out and figure out what that looks like. The other part of the cost I'll just jump into is how many pages are folks looking for? So are you looking for, a single page, just like down and quick and dirty? Then that's one thing versus 4, 6, 10. Who wants a 10-page study guide? That's a bit much, but that's going to make a difference right there. But yeah, I mean, I believe very strongly in pay people for their labor. So that's important. That's very important to me. Elaine asks, were you also responsible for the layout and design? No, I'm not a designer. But I did suggest a layout based on a book that I can't see that's across Abrams. So Abrams has beautiful, beautiful study guides for many of their, if not all, I don't think it's all of them, but for many of their graphic novel texts, Abrams is like gold standard. So I looked at a lot of those. I have used some of their study guides, and I suggested something that was kind of similar in terms of layout, and then I let the professionals handle it. I gave 4 pages of Word document text, and then I went on my merry way. Patrick asks, do your questions ever make connections with other works? Yes, whether comics or other media, or do they stay focused? I absolutely will ask. I try not to be too leading with that. I might have something in mind that they can connect to, but I try to ask open-ended, or suggest, I should say, open-ended questions that will lead, particularly in popular culture, that will lead to other, that are referential to popular culture in general. So yeah, I like to think of it in that intertextual thing, and suggest intertextuality. So, and one of the sort of reverse ways that I do that is in the overview of moments, of pop culture moments. So for example, with the reference to Carrie, I thought that was an important one to make sure that I fleshed out a little bit, to say, oh, in case you don't know, Carrie was a novel by Stephen King, and then it was also a film, and then they remade it, but we don't acknowledge that. And then, and that's not in the study guide. So yeah, I try to do some of that. And then, yeah, Abrams, I love Abrams. How much do you keep Common Core in mind when drafting, if at all? I have seen the guidelines, and then I start to glaze over. And so I would say overall, not at all, really. I just try to.
Could you explain Common Core to those of us who don't know what that is?
Someone else can explain Common Core. How about that? Because again, I'm not a K through 12. My understanding of Common Core, that these are standards, common standards across K through 12, right? If someone wants to explain that further. But this is one of the reasons I went into teaching at the college level, so I don't have to check mark those things. So and Abrams does some of that as well, and more power to them. But I just try to approach it from a more, I want to say, a common sense level. Not to say that Common Core is not common sense, but because I'm not an expert on that, I don't pretend to be an expert on that. So I'm just like, okay, if I were teaching this, what are the kind of questions that what are the discussions that I would want to generate? What would I want my students to think about? And then one thing that we haven't mentioned that I want to throw in there is that I'm also working on activities that involve drawing, that is not it. That was not within the scope of the one that I showed you. But I think that when we're talking about comics, and when I teach comics, I always have drawing exercises. So those are a good thing to integrate as well. And they can be anything from, drawing a favorite character. And I'm okay with tracing and that sort of thing. And that's how students start to develop their skill. But your interpretation of a character, right? Two, one of my favorite ones is, okay, so this story ends in this way. Do a one-page piece where you continue the story. How do you think this story should continue? And I get so much good stuff. I get chills just talking about that exercise. I love it. I love seeing what people come up with when they are continuing a story, because I'm like, oh, okay. Yeah, I could see how this would end. Some of it gets very scandalous, which of course are my favorite ones. And some of them are just innovative and things that I would not have thought of. But it's kind of empowering for folks who are studying these texts, because they get to take charge of that moment. And if they're not satisfied with how something ended, they get to then satisfy how they think it should have ended. And I really enjoy that.
All right. Any other questions or comments?
Any burning questions? I'm trying to think if there's anything else.
I'm also really curious just if there are other people in the group who have experience either writing their own study guides or using study guides in their classes. Crickets.
I can comment on, I have experience from the opposite direction, where I've had to advocate for I've made comics to be used for health education, for healthcare. So not in a classroom, maybe like something you give to a patient, or something you use like if you're a nurse and you're doing a coaching situation. And the problem there is that people, they don't have the time to read it. Maybe they don't know what to do with it. So, and not a study guide, but I've had to write documentation saying, here's what this is. Here's who created it and the evidence, so you can trust that we did our research and we know everything about it. Here's how you should use it. So not so much study questions, but more like, here's what you should do to give this to your patients and use it with them.
I think that's great that you brought that up, because that is a kind of study guide. This is an informational piece that can launch a discussion, or that helps you with the kind of questions that you should be asking, or how to, interpret information. Because even like in the medical field, we culturally we're very different about how we explain what's going on with our bodies, right? And so I love the idea of comics as, you might get this answer, but what this means is this, the whole what's wrong with you, nothing, I'm fine. That doesn't mean I'm fine. It actually means, different things depending on tone, depending on who you're speaking to, depending on sometimes gender, depending on culture, things like that. So I really like the idea of thinking about the kind of text you're talking about as a kind of medical study guide. Jim, you have a question?
No, not actually a question. Sorry, I was just responding to Kriota's question.
Yeah.
I've made study guides for a number of years, certainly while I was doing the mostly self-publishing comics about scientists. I'm not a graphic medicine person per se, but more a nonfiction about science comics person. That's a really long phrase. But have contributed to doing them for some of the publishers. That's why I probably should have declared an interest when I said Abrams does great work. I thought they did great work on a book that I did with them as well. But yeah, I'll maybe echo the roughly 16 hours of work each one. It's a couple days work. Yeah. Even if you know the book really, really well, which ostensibly I should have because they were my own.
I think it's a process of discovery too. You're like, oh, You know, well, that's deep. That's deeper than I thought it was. And that happens with one of my friends who will be working on a study guide in the future. Every time he comes in to guest for my class, they come up with new questions, and now they're making demands. My students are like, okay, so we don't know what happens with this character, so you need to make another book that addresses this relationship, and then let me know when that's done. He's like, whoa, demanding. But that also tells you that you know, as an audience member, what they're really saying is that was a moment, that was a moving moment, and they're leaning in, they want more. So that's valuable data, I think, as a creator. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, and then Elaine offers a little bit more explanation of Common Core and publisher classroom guides, which I think those are great. They're not so much in my wheelhouse. They're purposely not in my wheelhouse, but I think they're incredibly valuable. And again, this is a form of study guide. What I like too is that you can make it into all kinds of different things, right? Different forms. You can come up with different approaches. There are no, I shouldn't say there are no rules, but I don't really follow any particular rules other than just some obvious things. We need to introduce characters. We need to touch on anything that's outstanding that might be kind of mysterious to different kinds of readers. Because that's another thing to think about is, well, you have your ideal readers. So people who pick up, I mean, people who even just pick up this book, I know are calling it quince, right? And it's quince. And so that's not the ideal reader, but we want those readers as well. Of course, we want those readers. So then we can introduce them to quince and the quinceañera and this cultural moment, but also connect it to the larger superhero genre and that interest in superheroes. So I think that is one of the goals of the study guide, is to make the work more accessible, more. So it's not just, hey, I got to make a study guide so some professor can adopt this for a class, but how can I use that, the idea of a study guide, to make this work more accessible, potentially more relevant to larger audiences? And who as a creator doesn't want that, right?
That is great. We have the confab is officially 45 minutes long. Not that I've minded at all, but I'm just kind of saying to people, if you expected to leave 15 minutes ago and you have to bug out, that's fine. But if people like have questions or other things they want to ask before they leave the meeting, like now's the time to do it. Also, I just want to point out, I will take the transcript of the chat and I will send it to everybody on who's come to the email list, and also eventually I'll be sending you guys a link for the presentation, which will be on YouTube. But anyway, keep going, Theresa. I'm just giving.
Thanks so much for that. I really appreciate that. I think that's great. Now I'm like, what did I say? That's not going to be transcribed. So let's see. Jem says, I find the approach of preferring inference questions over phrasing questions from an author intention quite interesting. Exploring a deeper level of understanding and encouraging multiple interpretations and how comics can do so many things at once. That was one of the beautiful things about comics, isn't it? This idea that we can have many different readers, not just approaching it from different perspectives and experiences, but really getting different things out of the reading of it. And so the reading of the story, the narrative part, but also the reading of the art. I think that's something that I'm trying to develop more of and encourage, is that the reading of lines, the reading of color, the reading of the shading, the reading of shapes and figures, and also getting into things like how comics are representational. What is it that they're representing? How are they representing what they're representing? And really, I mean, if I could write, you know, maybe 8 to 10 page study guide where I do get into more of the reading, how to read a comic, maybe that's something that somebody will want in the future, that would be fabulous. But it's not something that fits into the, you know, the little compact thing that you're trying to do to just make it a little portable part of a text. But I love that idea of, like, when I teach, I'm very open-ended in that I'm not trying, even though I may try to get someone, you know, I'm trying to get you to an endpoint, I'm also trying to steer it in a way that makes sense to individuals reading the thing. So we can go in many different directions. And sometimes I want to get some, you know, the students or readers or whoever, I want to get them somewhere and they're like, no, 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 we're going this way and we're not going that ever again. So you have to, one of my friends said, it's like being a dungeon master, right? In D&D, some of you will get, maybe all of you will get that reference, where you're trying to get your characters over to the cave and they're down by the river and they're not thinking about the cave. So you're like, well, I guess I'm managing this so the things happen over by the river instead of by the cave. I can't believe I made a D&D reference, but there you go. So let's see. What else do you have? What else would you like to know? I'm sorry I don't have any escándalo to share. I wish I did, but it's all been good. Very good experiences with folks and people very open to the kinds of questions that I'm developing and the activities and interpretations and things. It's really good. And again, I encourage everyone to think about it or to enlist someone to maybe start putting these things together for you. I wish I could talk about, there's one project that it's one of those, people always have their secret projects and always was like big eye roll, oh, your secret project must be nice. And I'm working on a project on a study guide right now and I can't talk about it. So I get to say I kind of have a secret project. So Juan Carlos, how do you decide the length of the study guide? 4 pages is standard for me. I know that 4 pages takes about roughly 16 hours of work. That's pretty consistent. But if someone is looking for a larger piece, then we discuss it. Or if they're looking for something smaller, then we can discuss that as well. But I start at 4. That covers, as you could see what I shared, that covers a good amount of material. And it feels pretty, it feels substantial at 4 pages. You're welcome.
Well, I guess we can bring it to a close, but thank you so much, Theresa. This has really been incredible. And my head is like really bursting with ideas around how I might want to create study guides for myself. So
awesome. And I want to encourage folks, if you want to get in touch with me, if you have questions or you know, advice or, you know, what things not to do or whatever, I'm absolutely accessible. I'm going to put my my personal email here instead of my work email. It's rojasbud@yahoo.com. And yeah, feel free to email anytime. I'm generally very friendly. I can't promise to always be friendly, but I try to be generally friendly. But feel free. And oh, I do want to mention to folks, I want to, I mentioned I'm the director of the what is it that I do? The Latinx Comic Arts Festival. And that is, and as a matter of fact, I'm doing a study guide for my own festival. For an extra credit, there's an extra credit study guide coming out. If you're interested in that, I can share it as well. It's not done yet, but if you contact me, I'll share it with you when it's done. So this is the poster for that. It's March 12th and 13th. And we have 2 days of panels and discussions and possibly demos. We just got the submission, so I haven't seen those yet. But they're really cool things that are being submitted. There's one on, it was like, because it's Latinx, so there's one on like machismo and Latinx comics or something like that. And then there's another one on feminist feminist stylings in comics. There's a whole bunch of really cool things. We opened it up to folks I haven't met yet. So, and then there's going to be a virtual art gallery. So this will be the first virtual art gallery for a Latino event that I know of. I haven't heard of any others. We have our gallery director at the college is taking all of the images that I send her, and it's a really cool like walkthrough kind of thing. So you get that sense of being in an actual gallery, and then you click on pieces that you're interested in, and then you'll see them closer and you can get information about the piece. It is a super cool experience, and I can't wait to do that. So it's free. You are, it'll be live streamed to YouTube. And if you follow the website, there'll be more information, but the live stream is on the poster. So yes, be great to see you there. Thanks, MK. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the invitation. Thanks for being here. I really appreciate it.
So much, Theresa.
Yeah.
Thank you,
Can I
Theresa.
clap
That was
for
great.
myself? Thanks.
This has been really great. Thank you. And thank everybody for coming. Really
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you.
contributing. It's really
Thank you,
great to
guys.
see everybody.
Thank you.